Don, will you get us started by telling us how did this all begin in 1977?
Well, but first, let me say thank you to Joanne and the staff here, because whenever I would say something, it'd be done immediately. And it's not always that way.
It's true. It's very true. The staff have been wonderful. And Don and I are both so very grateful for this opportunity to see and celebrate so many of Layton's works all together in the same space. It's the biggest exhibition of her work in 25 years, so this is really an amazing opportunity. Will you get us started by taking us back to 77? It was Ottawa University. You saw some drawings that you described as troubled and troubling. Tell us about those.
That's right, it was 1977, and I was a newspaper reporter, always looking for something good to write about. And it seemed like I had written stories about everyone in Ottawa, so I was I was desperately seeking stories. And as I often did, I wandered into the student union because there was a big bulletin board and I would get story ideas there. But in the student union, there was an exhibit of works by college freshmen at Ottawa University. Well, I was once a college freshman, and I know what their art looks like, what my art looked like. And so these drawings all looked the same, muddy, undistinguishable. But then in one corner were two drawings of an old woman. She had sags and wrinkles. She was sad. And I was totally taken. I'd never seen anything like that before. And so I ran to find the teacher, Pal Wright, and said, "Who did those drawings of the old woman?" He said, "They're done by Grandma Layton." I said, "Well, tell me, are they good?" And he said, "Beats me." Now, I'm glad he's not here tonight because he might quarrel with that assessment. And but he will be here to see the exhibit. He was out of town for a while. So then I called Elizabeth and told her I'd like to write a story about her. She said no. But a couple of days later, she called me and said I could write a story about her art, but not about her. So that's how it got started.
Tell us about what you saw in those drawings that you were attracted to. You were saying that they were about an old woman. What else about them? They were sad. What did you think?
I thought they were beautiful. And that sadness in her drawings, at least in those early ones, which I saw first, they just spoke to me. And I spoke to her.
And Layton had been there to learn to draw at Ottawa University. It was her one course that she took in her one professional art instruction. And what was it that you said to her about what her work could do, how she might use her work? Because she was not interested in sharing the drawings. They were going to be under the bed.
Well, let me first make a statement about how she drew. She would look into a mirror and without looking at her paper, she would draw pictures of herself like this, which I didn't know at the beginning, but I did learn that. And it's a technique that's often done in beginning art classes, blind contour drawing. And so that's what she was doing, and that explained somewhat the distortions in those early drawings. Yes, they were of an old woman, but she gave herself many more wrinkles and sags than she had in real life. And I was so surprised when I met her and saw her, because she didn't have all those wrinkles and sags in real life.
Yeah. So she was interested in sort of emphasizing those visual characteristics of aging, also playing up that idea of being an older woman, of being a grandma, signing her works grandma. What were some of the issues that she was interested in? They were self-portraits, and they were also, she also had all sorts of concerns in the drawings.
That's right. There were all sorts of concerns in the drawings, and they weren't all sad. Some of them were hilarious, which we will talk about later.
Exactly. I've got up on the screen skipping down Christo's walkway, partly so that we can brag to people about her first prize that she won in 1978, but also so we can talk about the drawing.
Yes. Well, when I first saw her work and then met her, something clicked. I knew that her work was significant, and someone ought to do something with it, and I was the only one around. Her family wasn't going to do it. No offense to her family. They've been wonderfully supportive over these many years. And Pal Wright at Ottawa University had just abolished its art department. So he was looking for a job. And so I knew that it might have to be me.
And so what was it that you were interested in doing? Sharing them with people, writing about them, reaching museum audiences with them? What was your sort of vision for what you might do?
Well, I didn't know. I was 27. I didn't know anything. But I just knew I had to get it out there. And I knew that since she was 68, I didn't have time to fart around.
That's right.
I had to get those drawings out there so that she could enjoy the reception, and so that the world could.
That's right.
So when I started, that reception wasn't always so positive. The first few people I showed her drawings to said, "Oh my God, these are sick and depressing." And who would want to look at pictures of an old woman?
Yeah, really striking to me to hear that.
Pardon?
Really striking to me to hear that people were not wanting to see her in the images, not wanting to see an older woman, and even if it was slightly exaggerated as it may have been. But I think also too that there was a disinterest in hearing her voice, hearing what she had to say about any number of issues, because they could be pretty subversive. They had some terse political commentary.
I think those political commentaries went right over Wellsville.
Could be. So tell us about, you wrote for the Ottawa Herald.
Yes.
And then more and more coverage, you wrote more and more coverage, local and regional papers were picking it up. The Kansas City Star, you were sharing it with local and regional arts organizations like the Mid-America Arts Alliance, Kansas Arts Commission, Lawrence Arts Center. Tell us a bit about that, about reaching larger audiences, not just writing about the work, but sharing the images with people, sharing the drawings.
Well, after I had been a reporter at the Ottawa Herald for 5 years, I knew it was time for me to move on. I'd been there. I loved Ottawa, and I still do. but I knew I had to move on. And someone told me that there was a job opening as director of the Arts Council in Topeka. So I went to Topeka and had a wonderful interview, and I was hired to be the director of the Arts Council. So suddenly, my world expanded. I was getting to know artists and arts organizations, and it just fit into what I would be doing with Elizabeth's work.
That's right. And then tell us a bit about some of those first conversations that you had with art museums, because I think some of the organizations, I think local arts centers and councils were a bit more receptive than museum curators at first and other more formal institutions.
Yes, though the reception was different every place. One of the first places I took her works was the Spencer Museum at KU. They had a new program called Discovery Day, and you could bring in whatever work you had, and two assistant curators would tell you about it. And so I took 2 Layton drawings to Discovery Day and met with Betsy Brune, and she didn't know what to do with it. But she said, I don't know what to do with it. But she said, it is significant, and I will do something someday. That's what she said. And to skip forward a little bit, at some point, she became the director of the Spencer Museum, and then she became director of the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. So I would call her and send her clippings and things. And finally, she called and said, it's time.
And what did she mean by that? She meant it was time to acquire the objects. It was time for an exhibition.
Time for an exhibition.
Yeah. Drawing on life.
Yeah.
And so you went sort of on Layton's behalf. You were her, I'm going to be formal and say ambassador, but you were also her cheerleader. You were also there in the most personal way too, to support her and represent her at that exhibition. It was this moment of, I don't think it's possible to overstate this important moment of taking her work very seriously in the most serious museum of American art in the nation. This prestigious museum that really sets the standard for who are American artists that we want to think about and remember and collect and see. That was a huge moment.
Yes. You got that right.
Yeah.
Well, but let me tell you a couple of the things that happened in the meantime. Since I moved to Topeka, I was in the loop. And it wasn't always a very big loop. But they were starting a new program, the Kansas Arts Commission was, and they would organize exhibits that would travel. Because at the time, if you found someone who was doing really good landscape paintings, it would go to one place and then it was over. Mm-hmm. So with this touring program, you could maybe get your work toured for, say, 2 years, and it would go to a different town every other month. So that was a great deal. And I proposed a Layton exhibit, and it was passed by the Kansas Arts Commission, and they were delighted to have the exhibit that was so successful. Right then, I knew that program of touring artists was only for Kansas, but there was an organization called the Mid-America Arts Alliance, which would do the same thing nationally. It would tour art nationally. So I went to the proper person at the Mid-America Arts Alliance and said, you know, this after this Layton exhibit rents out in Kansas, you could tour it nationally. And the curator said, well, he said, I like the work, but I don't think there's a market for it. So we will pass. Well, that just got me fired up.
Yeah, yeah, I bet it did.
Actually, what happened was there was a man on the staff of the Mid-America Arts Alliance named Bob Purley, and he went to some kind of conference somewhere in Kansas, and quite by accident, he saw the Layton exhibit there and was so taken. And so he called and said, you know, I think we could tour this nationally, not just in Kansas, but nationally. I said, well, it won't work because one of your counterparts already rejected it. And he said, well, I'm overriding that.
Wow.
So after 3 years of touring in Kansas, the Layton exhibit went national.
And when it went national, major art critics, art historians, curators, the art world was interested right away, and people had great things to say. I have on the slide some of your and my favorite quotes that came out of the contemporary coverage. Alice Thorson, who many of us probably know and read often, wrote in the Kansas City Star that Layton is from a sociocultural standpoint, she was a very important artist. Betsy Brune said that Layton inspired people that there's still time, it's never too late, you can find a way. And then one of our favorites, Don, that we quote often, Kay Larson said, I'm tempted to call Layton a genius. So there was, go ahead, what were you going to say?
But let me tell you what Donald Hoffman said in the Kansas City Star.
That's right, it wasn't all glowing.
He said, her subjects are important, her drawings are not. I've been wanting to hook up with him sometime and punch him about that.
Yeah. Let's look at some drawings. I want to go to some of the wonderful objects that are in the show. I have on the slide objects that come directly from the Nerman Museum's collection. We have Untitled Censored, which is, Don and I have been thinking of as sort of a signpost for the exhibition, letting people know what it's about. In the center, The Sneeze, and on the right, Commemorative to Artists of the Holocaust. Will you talk us through some of the things that Layton was so passionate about that she wanted to express in her work, and some of the ways that she's doing that in that sort of so-called unimportant way?
Well, Elizabeth Layton may have looked like everyone's grandmother, but underneath that grandmotherliness was a brilliant and sensitive person. And I don't know how she got that combination, but I got to know it well since I visited her home every week for 15 years. But I would never tell her what to do. We would talk about things, and I never watched her draw because I thought, I've pretty much taken over her life. And I'll let her draw by herself.
Yeah.
So the drawings here that are in the Nerman collection, one is commemorative to artists of the Holocaust. And so in it, what she's saying is, we of the deaf ears and blind eyes support you. Too late, we answer. And one image in that is a ship called the St. Louis. And you would learn in a history book that the St. Louis was filled with Jews from Germany who had escaped and commandeered this ship. And they thought, oh, how fortunate we are. We are free from Germany. So they brought the ship to the United States. And we said, our government said, well, sorry, you can't come in. We've already exceeded the quota of people from your country. So they were not allowed in. And I think they went to a couple of other places too and were not admitted. So they turned around, went back to Germany, where most of them went to the camps. And then there's a drawing here called The Sneeze. It looks like two old people. They are sitting at their coffee table, and they have winter colds. So on the table in front of them are all these bottles and ointments and pills and things one would take when one has a cold. And if you look at it, you'll see Glenn sneezing because his bottom is, he's going, achoo! But then there's a statement that Elizabeth was making with that drawing. And that's the thing she could do so well. She could be ordinary, and then she could hit you over the head at the same time. And in The Sneeze, you will see that there are oranges on the armchairs. These oranges are from California and Texas. This was the year that the former Miss America, Anita Bryant, you're on it. Anita Bryant, she was also the spokesman for Florida Oranges. And she had made some anti-gay remarks. So what Elizabeth was saying with her oranges from California and Texas, I don't care how sick we get, we are not eating those Florida oranges. Next.
That's right. We can do this all evening. There's a show full of, let's think about some loans from the Mulvane Art Museum. We've got Pulling the Plug, Intensive Care Room, Void, and Light.
Void is her drawing about depression, about her own depression, which she had battled for 30 years. She had 13 shock treatments. And so, about her life, her parents ran the local newspaper, and they told her when she had graduated from high school, "Now, Elizabeth, it's time for you to go to college." Well, she went to Ottawa University for 2 years and pretty much hated it because she was in love. And what she wanted to do was get married, have lots of babies, and live happily ever after. And so, but her friends, her girlfriends and her parents were saying, "Elizabeth, you should not marry that man. He drinks too much. And we've heard that he is a womanizer." But Elizabeth married him anyway. And she hadn't been married for very long before she realized that they were right. But by then she was pregnant. And women's choices were few. So she stayed married, I think, for 12 years, and during that time had 5 children and at least that many miscarriages. And then when her father died, she took over his newspaper. But she told me that writing and working at the Wellsville Globe was not like working for the New York Times or even the Ottawa Herald. She said, in Wellsville, at the Wellsville Globe, if you invite a neighbor for a donut, that is a story.
Pretty big news. People need to know that.
So she worked there for, I think, 20 years while she was raising her children. These were the days before mandatory child support. So generally, when there was a divorce, the women did the work. And the men, God knows where they were, womanizing. And so she raised her 5 children, and but then she met, or she hooked up with Glenn Layton. She knew him because when Glenn's first wife was ill, Elizabeth helped take care of her. So Glenn had seen Elizabeth in her nurturing spirit. And so after Edith died, and there was a little time in there, Glenn and Elizabeth got married. And that was at the end of Elizabeth's shock treatments. And Glenn didn't care. He married her anyway.
But she had been struggling tremendously with mental illness and had tried most every avenue that she could, and found both that drawing, both rendering what it was like to be struggling so deeply, but also the therapeutic effort of drawing was healing for her. I want to show people masks and talk about what she's representing there.
Yeah, Mask is owned by the Beach Museum at K-State. And she's just wearing the masks that women wear and that men wear. And if you notice in one corner, there are a couple bottles of pills. They are uppers and downers. So she knew what she was talking about in her struggles. But what had happened after her shock treatments, and she married Glenn, her sister in California, her sister had taken one of those Saturday morning art classes for old people, where you learn to paint pretty pictures of mountains and flowers. And so her sister said, Elizabeth, you've got to do something different with your life. Why don't you do what I do and take an art class? So at the age of 68, Elizabeth enrolled at Ottawa University, the same college she had gone to as a young woman. She was wearing her tennis shoes. She had one bad leg. She was overweight. And so all of her classmates, who were 19, started calling her grandma. And she liked that because grandma she referred to the grandma as the woman in the drawings, but she herself was Elizabeth, different from the woman in the drawings.
I have on the screen to share with people to think about how she was, that she was so intentionally thinking about body image and the way that other people tend to read women's bodies, particularly large women's bodies, the sneakers flung over her shoulders and Nike Winged Victory, and that she sort of, when I look at this drawing, I think of her sort of just knowing people will stare and letting them do that, and then sort of having the last word along the way.
That is a most wonderful drawing. And I'm so pleased that it is here for this exhibit because it's owned by the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And it's just such a perfect drawing for that museum. It's Elizabeth Layton naked. And she is the Winged Victory, the famous statue that's at the Louvre. And if you look at the statue, or look at Elizabeth's statue herself, you will see that, in the original sculpture of Winged Victory, the head and the arms are broken off. But in Elizabeth's Winged Victory, she has sprouted arms and a head. So that's what happened to Elizabeth through her art, through the Winged Victory.
I love the way that you put that, because I think that beginning to work as an artist gave Layton, not that she had no voice before, but that this gave her a way of amplifying her voice and visualizing all sorts of sort of complicated, whether intricately humorous or kind of intricately political and critical. I have up on the screen continuing to think about body image and sort of relishing in it. I am loved.
That drawing is owned by the Kemper Museum, and so it's herself as an old woman, but when you look at it, you look hard because this is what you'll see. In the center is Elizabeth as a young woman. And that's probably a 22-inch waist. And you see, it's pretty decrepit. It's an old dress, but that was her wedding dress. And then you see what has happened to her body since then. It's about this big around, and because that's what happens to people. They get bigger. And then what she did was, of course, her veil was long gone. So she got out her kitchen apron and used it as her veil. And in Elizabeth's class, one of her assignments was to use an object that you normally wouldn't put in a work of art. And Elizabeth had seen those I Am Loved buttons at the Kansas City jewelry store, and so she got out the I Am Loved button and pinned it on herself. That was Helzberg's that gave out those I Am Loved buttons.
I bet there are a bunch of those at home in some people's jewelry boxes.
Yes.
Before we turn it over to questions, you're bringing up the wonderful button pinned into I Am Loved, makes me think of remembering names.
Oh, yeah.
And, you go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, with the drawing called Remembering Names, Elizabeth was home in Wellsville, chatting with a longtime friend of hers, when the subject of AIDS came up. And her friend said, "Well, it seems to me those people deserve to die." Well, Elizabeth had a friend from Lawrence, an artist, who was dying of AIDS. And she didn't think he deserved to die. So she did this drawing about the Names Project, the wonderful quilt that traveled all across the country, commemorating the lives and deaths of people who died of AIDS. Now, I would want to show that to the art critic of the Kansas City Star, who said that her subjects were important, but her drawings were not. She could make beautiful, strong statements.
That's right. Well, I could chit-chat. We have so many wonderful drawings to think through, but I wonder what questions people in the audience have, or comments, statements.
I want to know how many people here own a Layton drawing.
Yeah, I want to know that too. Wow, wow, wow.
So, questions? You could just get a hook and drag me off, because otherwise I could probably talk all night.
That is never going to happen, Don. Nobody's taking your mic away.
This is just a small curiosity, but after she started drawing, did she continue to draw with the mirror herself and then fill the rest in directly?
She would use that technique, the blind contour drawing, to fill in the outlines. And then she would look down and color in the fabric of the dress and other details. But she used that technique for the outline of all of her drawings. And she did 1,000 drawings. So she got pretty good at it.
Did you ever present at the Kansas Art Education Association many years ago?
I'm sure I did. Really, I was running ragged for a while because Elizabeth only liked staying home. And she didn't, after the first year, she didn't go to anything. And I went to everything.
And continue to.
Yeah. Pardon?
Another person.
Hi. Oh, sorry, back here. I'm a professor from Ottawa University in the art department, so we did get our art department back.
Welcome.
It's a real pleasure to hear about Elizabeth Layton tonight. I was curious, just thinking about, the time when you discovered her would have been, parallel to the points where the feminist art movement was growing out of the second wave. How did the feminist art movement respond to Elizabeth? And with her kind of progressive standpoints on many things, did she consider herself actually to be a feminist?
Did she consider herself what?
To be a feminist. How did
Oh.
the feminist movement respond to her work? Because it was so closely timed with the emergence of the organized feminist movement and among art historians and art critics. And did Elizabeth consider herself a feminist?
Well, she was a feminist, even though she probably didn't call herself that. But the women's movement, they were only remotely interested in her work. Ms. Magazine did a story about her, which I had proposed, but it did not show any of her works.
Yeah.
So my feeling was that the strong feminists, they all wore silk blouses that they bought for $200. And when you saw this old woman, they didn't relate. That's my impression. I mean, they did in substance, but not in exterior.
That's a great point. And if I could just chime in, I would say that Layton was also really interested in thinking of feminism very expansively and with a long view. So for example, many of you who are Kansans in the room, or also maybe not, will remember Carrie Nation. And that's one example of many historical women that Layton was very interested in, felt a connection to.
Do we have that slide?
We sure do.
Okay. This is owned by the Wichita Art Museum. And so there's Carrie Nation, and she actually lived not all that far from Wichita. And we remember Carrie Nation because she she would march into saloons and destroy liquor bottles. So we all thought she was a goofball. But people in the Wild West, in Kansas and elsewhere, consumed a lot of liquor. And it was destroying families. It was destroying individuals. And Elizabeth knew that because alcohol had destroyed her husband, it had destroyed her marriage, and it destroyed her son. So while she hated alcohol, what she's saying in here is that her hatred of alcohol was not good for her. It helped destroy her. So it's a very complicated drawing.
Thank you for sharing that.
We have one question here, and then I'll get to this question over here. I think we'll just two questions.
Oh, thank you. What I notice about her work, which I think is so interesting, and I wanted to ask about this, she's not somebody who's traveled the world at all. Mm-hmm. Yet her world, she made it so big, even though it was so small, and I find that really fascinating. And somehow I think it's her depression that gave her this outsized compassion for everything around her. And it was before the internet. You couldn't just look stuff up.
No.
And she had to go out of her way to research. So I was wondering, did she have all these books around her all the time?
Well, a couple of things to be considered about that. I mean, you're right. but her parents ran the newspaper, and she ran it for 20 years. And her mother's twin sister was a professional photographer in Ottawa. Elizabeth's great aunt was the book editor of the New York Times and was an early feminist, radical feminist, marched with the early feminists. So Elizabeth was exposed to a lot of things, and she knew a lot of things, but because of some choices she had made in her life and what life in general was like back then, it seems that some of those ideas didn't sink in as much as we might have wanted, and that she might have wanted.
I couldn't agree. I think that is an excellent question. I think that question in itself sort of characterizes Layton's work generally, that she is tremendously intellectually curious and interested in the way that her work could transport her, that her imagination and education, and not only education about works in the Louvre Museum, which she had not visited, or Christo and Jean-Claude's wrapped walkways in Kansas City's Luce Memorial Park, which Layton did not visit herself, that she was so interested in what learning, not just about neat experiences, but that other people's human experiences. For example, suffering from complications of AIDS, just one example. She was so interested in what imagination could do.
Yes, she read the Kansas City Star cover to cover every day. So we see this worldliness in her journalism, which was, she had grown up with it. And so this drawing, skipping down Christo's walkway, I love telling that story. The Nelson Atkins in Kansas City had a contest every year, which was sponsored by the Junior League. And it was open to any artist from the 4-state region. So it was called Mid-4, the 4 states in the middle. And so any artist could enter, and they would review all of the slides from the people who had submitted them. This particular year, there were 600 entries. People had sent in slides about 600 artists. And so I sent in Elizabeth's slide, skipping down Christo's walkway. And at this time in my life, it just seemed like my efforts on Elizabeth's behalf were not being greeted as I had expected. And so I learned that there was a job opening at the museum in Omaha. So I went to Omaha, and I was to meet with the museum curators the next day. So that evening, I called Elizabeth. I said, well, did you hear anything from the Mid-4 people? And she very slowly said, well, yes, I did. I said, well, what'd they say? And she said, I got first place. So, if you're as old as I am, you remember skipping down Christo's walkway. You remember when Christo wrapped the sidewalks of Luce Park with this wonderful yellow-orange fabric. So she had written to somebody in Kansas City saying, could she borrow a bit of that fabric? So they sent her a little sample, and that's how she got her color. After I got that response from Elizabeth, I thought, I don't need to work in Omaha. So I returned to Kansas because I really knew that that's where I needed to be. And Elizabeth donated that drawing to the Nelson. And that was such an interesting experience for me and Elizabeth. She and Glenn went to the opening at the Nelson, and it was organized by the Junior League. Now, some of you might have forgotten what the Junior League is, but it is women of a certain socioeconomic background who are trying to do good things for the community, but they're always dressed to the nines. So here were the Junior League ladies, and here was Elizabeth in her running shoes and her house dress that she probably bought for $12.97 at the women's store in Baldwin. And they were so nice to her. And she was so taken with the Junior League and the Nelson and all the artists she met. And so it turned out to be a great experience for all of us.